All right, I am now joined by Aaron Rabinowitz of the Embrace the Void podcast, who is actually fresh from where I am right now, which is Atlanta, because he was at the American Atheists convention there over the weekend. How are you doing, Aaron?
I'm doing great. I apologize if I sound a little rusty. I was indeed at the convention. We had a lot of fun, and I got to talk to a lot of great people, which meant a lot of great talking, which might make me a little hoarse. But I'm excited to have this chat. I'm sorry we didn't get to do it in person, but I think it's still going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah, yeah, same. So yeah, let's. So let me just get the stuff out of the way to get out of the way before we start. So since we are 2 days away and I'm in relentless, shameless promotion mode, I will say anybody who is in the Toronto area on Thursday and Friday. On Thursday, I'm doing an event for the Hitchens book at the Duke of York pub at 7 p.m. Do a reading, sign in, Q&A. I think Matt McManus and Victor Brazone are going to be taking the lead on that, just kind of hanging out, drinking for as long as we've got the room. And then on Friday, giving a talk at the philosophy department on Ryerson about Marx and philosophical liberalism, really Marx and Rawls and Cohen and philosophical liberalism. I know we've already got a pretty good turnout. That's free tickets, but we are ticketing it just to kind of control the space. So I think we've probably got like 70% or so of the seats filled up. So if you do want to slip in, still you can do that. So just go over my Twitter. That's the twinned pinned tweet to find that. But that's more than enough of that. So I want to get into the actual meat of what we're here for. I should say that part of how this idea came up in the first place is that we were good-naturedly arguing on Twitter about this, which happened after your appearance on one of my very favorite podcasts, actually, "What's Left of Philosophy."
Yeah,
So, do you
hard
want
co-sign on that. Hmm.
to? Yeah. So, before we actually start up the debate itself, do you want to say anything about that, or context, or anything like that?
Yeah, that was a really great chat that I got to have with those folks about this paper that I've recently written that I'm hoping to get submitted here soon. I'm just doing a little bit of like final checking because some of it
Mm,
goes into the psychology world, and I am a philosopher. And so I want to make sure that I am getting the psychology side correct. But
mm,
I do think there's a substantial position there that may challenge current assumptions about a variety of things in education. And so I was excited about that, and I shared it with
yes.
them, and they really dug it. So we had a fun chat, and I'm excited to hear sort of your potential concerns with this view.
Perfect. Okay. So I guess the way that we will start up that we agreed to in advance is that we'll just kind of do sort of in between, something a little bit more structured and and just kind of talking. So we'll do opening statements and then try to transition. I mean, if like maybe you know, after after the second one, maybe we could do a little bit of sort of couple minutes of saying something about it back and forth, but like try to transition pretty quickly into freewheeling open discussion, respond to what the other person said, ask each other questions, take some, super chats, other questions from the chat. So I'm good either way, but I think you indicated that since I have kind of the position that you're sort of pushing back against in some ways, that you thought it makes sense if I went first, so I will go ahead and do that. I'll say in advance that so we've kind of got two topics here because I think we actually interestingly disagree about both of them. One of them is there some important sense in which free will exists, and then the other one is does it matter? Why is that important? Like what are the sort of moral or political consequences of that? And I think we have interesting disagreements about both of them. I think for myself, for this kind of opening, I am just going to stick to the first one, just because there's maybe so much to say about it that I think that if I just kind of do that, and then you can tell me why free will doesn't exist and why that's important, and then I could maybe try to fill in why I have a different perspective on the sort of moral or political fallout of it than you do.
Yeah, sounds
But
great.
okay, perfect. Okay, so we'll start off with that like that. So yeah, as I say, there are two questions. The title of the debate. I want to address them both in the order, but right now, just the first one, which I actually think might be, I think there might be a methodological upside to only having time for the first one right now, because I think one thing we could probably agree on is that there is something maybe analytically useful about separating these questions, right? That we don't want to say either it would really suck if there was no such thing as free will, therefore there is free will, or it would really suck if there were, therefore there isn't, right? In either case, that would be bad methodology. So let's just talk for now, at least for mine, about whether there is or isn't, and I think that might be useful to just start by talking about one important reason, not the only reason, but one important reason why many people think there isn't. So one important reason has to do with determinism about physical causation, which is the view that every physical event is caused by previous physical events plus, law-like regularities in the physical world. I always tell intro to philosophy students to think back to physics classes they might have taken in high school or earlier in college, where you might have got word problems about the baseball going at the bat at a certain speed and angle and all that, and where it's going to end up. And the assumption is that if you have all the physical inputs, you can stick that in your equations and pop out the result. And causal determinism is the claim that everything is like that, that everything that ever happens is determined by sort of initial conditions plus physical laws. And of course, decision making in the human brain isn't going to be some sort of special magical exception to those general physical laws. So many people believe this is a view called incompatibilism, that if causal determinism is true, that means there just can't be such a thing as free will. So a completely deterministic universe is one where there's no room for autonomous human decision making. We're just kind of meat puppets being pulled around by in, invisible strings. Lots of people in the history of philosophy have held this position. Lots of people right now believe this, but not all incompatibilists are the same. Some of them believe that we are, in fact, living in a deterministic universe and therefore we don't have free will, while others believe that we aren't living in a deterministic universe and decision making in the human brain really is a mysterious, spooky exception to the general laws of physical cause and effects. So that's one kind of argument that people can have about the existence of free will. It's an argument about how physical reality works. Um, I should also add, just to be complete, that some people say free will doesn't exist, whether determinism is true or it's false, because the only way determinism can to any extent be false is if, to that extent, causation is just random, and determinism and randomness are equally bad for free will. So we don't have it either way. That's also a respectable position, although, as we'll see, not really one I hold. Another kind of argument that people can have about free will is an argument that's not about the nature of physical reality at all. It's really an argument about language, or maybe what philosophy nerds call conceptual analysis. So this one is an argument about what we mean when we say free will, or maybe what we mean when we use phrases like "you were free to do X," or "you could have done not X if you'd wanted to." And there, some people think that when we say one of those phrases, what we're claiming is that no physical law, even given all of the initial conditions, would have restrained you from doing whatever you're doing. Other people say, no, it doesn't have to be true that your action wasn't determined by physical laws at all for you to be acting freely, um, because that if you think about how we use words like can and could in ordinary language, I mean, think about if you're camping. I've got G.A. Cohen on the mind, so got camping examples. And a boulder rolls down to right next to your tent, and then you see it the next morning when you wake up. You might say that could have crushed us. You don't mean that it could have, given its initial position and the angle at which it's rolling and the speed at which it's rolling, because given all that initial setup, no, it could not have crushed you. What you mean is maybe that we wouldn't have to change the conditions very much for it to have crushed you, or we mean that if it had started at a slightly different angle, nothing would have stopped it from crushing us, or something like that. And similarly, to bring it to human free will, if I got hit by a car and I'm still alive, but just barely, and Aaron sees me and shrugs and keeps walking, we could say that he could have helped me. And all that means is that if we kept everything about the situation the same except for which decision he made, then he would have helped me. And that, according to another view, is what free will is. That's pretty much like David Hume's position, for example, about what free will is. Now, to put my cards on the table about these two debates, these two kinds of debates about whether we have free will, I think the first kind of argument is pretty uninteresting since I just can't take seriously the idea that we have mysterious, spooky powers to override the laws of physics with our will. So if that's what free will means, I'm on Aaron's side of the argument and I don't have much else to say about it. The second argument is a little bit more interested, and I think that people with that kind of simple compatibilist position, that yeah, free will is compatible with determinism, because if we really look at what we mean by it, then I think that kind of position, I think they are being more reasonable than their critics sometimes give them credit for. Sometimes people who don't like that position accuse those simple compatibilists of just playing with words or quote unquote changing the definition of free will. And I don't think those charges are quite fair. I think that compatibilists like that are actually putting their finger on something real about how words like could or can often work in ordinary language. And I'd be happy to get more into that later in the discussion. But I don't really want to linger on it because I don't think the second way of debating free will is actually the most interesting or important debate we could have about free will either. The reason I don't think it's the most interesting or important one we could have is that it's the kind of debate that we could resolve just by clearing up how each of the two people are using the term. We could just call my sense of free will FWB for free will Ben, and Aaron's sense FWA for free will Aaron, and then we're not disagreed anymore. We could just agree that FWB exists and FWA doesn't exist, and the stream could end early, and we could just go have a beer or something. Where things become interesting again, to my mind, is when we ask a slightly different question, which is what kind of free will would have to make sense of some philosophically important and interesting concept, like, for example, moral responsibility. What kind of control does somebody have to have over their actions for it to make sense to say that what they did was their fault, or conversely, to make sense to say that what they did was to their credit, that it was praiseworthy? Well, what I was calling FWB earlier, and I really should have called maybe FWH for free will Hume, that kind of basic bitch compatibilism, is that you have free will as long as your decision, your preference, played the right role at a crucial link in the chain of cause and effect, and nothing would have stopped you from acting on a different decision if you made a different decision. And that is a kind of control that we definitely have, even in a worst case scenario version of determinism. But I think Aaron and I actually agree that FWH wouldn't be sufficient for moral responsibility or most other interesting and important concepts that might seem to be linked up with some kind of free will. So how about FWA, free will Aaron? Well, when he does his opening, he can correct me if I've misunderstood his position. But when he went on What's Left of Philosophy and said we don't have free will, what he seemed to mean, as far as I could tell, was that we don't have a kind of control over our actions. We'd only have if the chain of cause and effect leading us to act the way we didn't involve any element we don't have control over. His view seems to be a kind of view of free will where actions count as free if they're free of luck, like the way that Henry Hill in Goodfellas says he couldn't be a made man in the mob because the requirement was that they be able to trace all of his ancestors on both sides back to Italy and make sure there are no vendettas. On this view of free will, there can't be any taint of luck, any taint of anything outside our control in any of the ancestors of your decision and the whole chain of cause and effect leading up to it, or else it doesn't count. And I actually agree with Aaron that we don't have a FWA. Free will Aaron wouldn't be possible if determinism were true. In fact, I don't think it would be possible whether or not determinism was true, for kind of the reason that I gestured at earlier, that that there are also problems about randomness and all of that. Especially put the way that Aaron likes to put it in terms of luck. I think that makes that connection very clear. So in the What's Left of Philosophy discussion, Aaron seemed to dismiss FWH as mere causal influence, and then to say that that's not enough for responsibility. Fair enough. And then also very sensibly to say that FWA doesn't exist, and therefore to conclude that moral responsibility doesn't exist. And the point I really want to make here is that there are lots of kinds of control that are both stronger than FWH, but weaker than FWA. And my view is that all the sort of conceptual space of like interested and plausible compatibilisms are somewhere in between those two. And I think that some of the views in between those two some of the kinds of control that we could have that are more interesting than FWH, less demanding than FWA, I think some of those others are things that we clearly do have, even if we live in a completely deterministic universe. And I think it's plausible to say that one of the ones somewhere in those space is the one that matters for moral responsibility. The particular kind that I lean towards, so this would be the true FWB, free will Ben, is the kind outlined most famously by a philosopher named John Martin Fisher, and somewhat less famously by my good friend Ryan Lake. You can read his doctoral dissertation about it online. It's called No Fate But What We Make. And on that view, what matters is not that the process is luck free at every ancestral link in the causal chain, but rather that it arises out of what those guys call a reasons responsive mechanism. In other words, the relevant capacity is our ability to understand reasons for and against different forms of courses of action, to weigh them against each other, to be at least somewhat moved by reasons for or against act in a certain way, which is of course a matter of degree, but that there's a threshold that we need to reach. And that's the kind of control that I think matters for moral responsibility, maybe also for some other important concepts that might get into some of the moral and political fallout that I tease for later, and that I think we could have even if determinism is true. But on that subject of how all this might relate to some of the moral and political values Aaron and I might actually share, I do have a lot of thoughts about this, but I want to wait on those thoughts until Aaron has had his say.
Man, thanks. That was great. I appreciate that so much. I think I was really excited to have this chat with you, Ben, because I think it has a high chance of being productive, specifically because I think we agree on the stakes. I think we agree on many of the major premises. And I think we can avoid either a slide into like semantic stalemate or a pure war of intuitions and just like focus in on where we really disagree. I also want to give you a shout out. That was a solid Goodfellas reference, and I'm absolutely stealing that for my arguments. Um, first of all, I think we can. I think you're right. Our debate doesn't depend on determinism or indeterminism. Under both models, on my view, our actions lack the kind of control needed for free will and moral responsibility. I think we agree on the stakes that the issue of free will comes down to a debate about whether or not there is a self that is independent of luck, sufficient that it can be held morally responsible for its behavior and deserves things as a result, like praise and blame. But I think we also agree that this debate can't just be determined by whether or not we really, really want moral responsibility to actually exist, right? There has to be an argument showing that we can sufficiently ground the existence of that independent self. And then we can debate the consequences one way or another for moral responsibility. Okay. And I also want to add, I think, from my reading of it, the psychological literature on free will also supports that this is the main stakes, right? That like what really matters here. And what I'm pointing to is research that suggests that there is a decent amount of correlation between belief in free will, a desire for retributive justice, and general traditional conservative and political mindsets. So insofar as I think you and I are both against those mindsets, I think we both care that we adopt a view, or we hope that we can adopt a view that argues against those positions. The reason these are the stakes, I think, is because, as I think you referenced there, and as other folks in this world have pointed out, Nagel presents in his chapter on moral luck a really powerful argument against belief in free will and moral responsibility, having to do with the pervasiveness of luck, especially most importantly, the kind of luck that we call constitutive luck, which is the luck that makes you who you are. Basically, the way the argument goes is, we can still hold people responsible despite the luck of how things turn out or the luck of their situation if we focus our judgments of moral responsibility inward and decide to judge them purely for their actions. And maybe if they are also the kind of individual who has a correctly developed moral character, then it will make sense to hold them morally responsible. And what Nagel argues is, if you really take seriously the pervasiveness, the nature of luck, whether or not someone has that desired constitution is itself a matter of luck, and therefore holding them responsible for anything that follows from that constitution violates what he calls the control condition, which is this very strongly held moral intuition that is again cross-cultural, that it's not acceptable to hold someone morally responsible for things that are beyond their control. So really what we're all, I think, what you and I are both concerned about here is, do we have the kind of control over our actions that is necessary to hold somebody morally responsible? Now, as you pointed out here, and in your previous discussion with Dave Pizarro and Ryan Lake, whose dissertation you sent me and which I really enjoyed, this debate really hinges on what kind of control is actually needed for moral responsibility. So we have to, I believe, disambiguate the concept of control, because there are multiple definitions running around in this debate. I think 2 definitions actually will be sufficient for us to distinguish. Now, you pointed out one of them in your intro, which is what I call causal influence. Now, I should say, I don't know anybody who's put it in exactly these terms. There are folks who I think are on a similar page as me, like Greg Caruso and Neil Levy. Both of them have similar sort of hard incompatibilist positions, we'll call it, to avoid the whole discussion of determinism. But what I think they are also getting at, and the way I put it is, there are 2 kinds of control. There is causal influence, and there's robust control. Causal influence is the thing we all experience all day, every day, when we're moving around, moving things around, doing things and such. Poses no problems, I think, in any kind of universe, and as I think we both agree, is not sufficient to ground moral responsibility. Then we have this kind of robust control where, as you said, we need to have dominant causal influence, I call this causal dominance, over every step of the chain. This is the only way I can see for us to sufficiently protect the final step of the chain from the influence of luck, right? This is because of what a guy named Kaufman calls the luck infection thesis, which is the idea that any event caused by luck is itself also a form of luck, right? It infects it along the chain that way. I don't see any way to reject that idea. I don't see any way to reject Nagel's concerns about constitutive luck. And I think it's fair to say that what he's really raising a problem for there is causal, or is robust control, not causal influence. I think we can all agree that, like, his argument is effective not because it makes us doubt whether we have causal influence. It makes us doubt whether or not we have robust control. So I think that's the kind we want, and it's the kind we can't have. Now, while we can't have that, we can, I think, still maintain belief in moral truths. I think it's actually, while it's a little bit counterintuitive initially, we can pretty cleanly pull apart the idea that there are moral truths and people can act rightly or wrongly with regard to those moral truths, and the question of whether or not those individuals are morally responsible. We do this all the time for all the kinds of situations where we have sufficiently exculpatory factors that we feel that the person isn't actually going to be held responsible, even though they did something bad. You know, a small child accidentally hurts somebody. They don't understand what they did. We don't hold them morally responsible, but we still agree that they did something bad in the sense that they harmed somebody. So I think we can maintain our understanding of moral truths while recognizing that whether someone happens to act morally or immorally is ultimately a matter of luck. I think this idea is supported by things like Aristotelian virtue theory, where Aristotle, recognizes that the necessities of early childhood habituation mean that, you don't really have control over whether or not you develop good character, or, what Dennett would call elbow room, which is essentially what I think, is close to what y'all are getting at when you talk about an individual who has the reason responsive mechanism, right? I think reason responsive mechanism is one way to cash out this broader category of elbow room approaches, where we're saying, well, we recognize that you didn't have ultimate control, but if you're lucky enough to be the sort of individual who has an understanding of moral beliefs and is able to act on them because you have the right disposition, then we can hold you morally responsible. And I think that, to me, is just a refusal to engage with the problem of constitutive luck. It outright says your constitution is the result of luck, but if you got lucky, we're going to hold you responsible. And I think that's the wrong way to go about this, because whether or not you have that constitution is the result of luck. And so it doesn't make sense to praise someone who acts morally any more than it makes sense to blame somebody who has the bad luck of being, an immoral individual, being born a psychopath, for example. So I don't think the elbow room approach can solve the problem. The other alternatives are a noble lie approach, where we acknowledge that there is no solution, but we lie to everybody and just pretend that free will still exists. A guy named Smolansky, for example, argues explicitly for this approach. I think that this is also both immoral and harmful. I don't think it's necessary, and I think it causes harmful consequences like meritocracy. And then, so I'll also quickly address your FWH or FWB approach, right? So you say reason responsive mechanisms, relevant capacity to understand reason for and against. It's not clear to me how that escapes the problem that Dennett's classic elbow room does, which is just whether you have that capacity or not is a matter of constitutive luck. And so it doesn't ground moral responsibility any better than anything else. So ultimately, I see no way to refute this. This has serious consequences. It means, for example, nobody deserves, I go the full route here. I say nobody deserves anything. There's a side argument we can have about whether people deserve basic human rights because of who they are in virtue of being a sentient being, for example. I don't think it's worth even saving dessert in that concept. But we can have, that's not as important as it making it very, very clear on no uncertain terms. Nobody deserves to suffer on this view. Nobody deserves to be punished. Moral consequences for people's behaviors have to be justified by something else if they're going to be justified at all. It's a bullet that I'm willing to bite. I know that it's distressing to some people who feel like certain people really do deserve to be punished. But I think that's a situation where what we might desire to be the case can't justify us in believing that it is in fact the case. And that actually, I think we're better off if we come to realize that even those who do wrong, in a Socratic kind of way, don't have any more control over their actions, and so don't deserve praise or blame any more than anybody else. So at the end of the day, I think, and then the policy conclusions, right? I think what follows from this are radical redistributions of wealth and changes to society on a bunch of different levels, not just the criminal justice system. We need to, rebuke meritocracy. And I think that my approach, more than other approaches that I've seen, is able to genuinely cut at the heart of the moral argument for meritocracy, which is an argument that I think lefties in general are struggling to undermine because they can't get away from this belief in free will and desert and praise and blame. And so they still end up thinking that, like, if people were in the right positions in the right kinds of ways, then people would deserve to fail. And that leads to a conclusion that it's okay to have various kinds of inequality that I think are ethically unjustifiable. So I think there are substantial implications. I think you and I disagree pretty substantially here. And so I'm excited to hear how you feel like you can protect your position from the problem of constitutive luck in a way that doesn't just sort of hand wave it away so that we can continue to believe that it is, real for justification of other things.
Yeah, so I agree with you, of course, that the noble lie approach is repugnant, which cuts both ways, right? If it really were true that belief in free will had politically conservative implications, we shouldn't do a leftist noble lie and say that free will doesn't exist, and vice versa, right? They have we should just believe and say whatever seems to be true after evaluating all of the arguments and counter arguments. I do think that the dead at elbow room view is pretty different from the Fisher Lake kind of view. So I might be getting his view slightly wrong, but but my understanding.
I should be clear. I think they're only sufficiently similar in the sense that they both suffer from the problem of constitutive luck.
Okay,
In no other ways besides that. I think they may have totally different accounts of what it
gotcha,
means to have elbow room, quote unquote.
gotcha. Yeah, because I think actually the whole elbow room metaphor is really kind of about freedom to do otherwise, right? Um, which I think that a big sort of tradition of thinking about free will and compatibilism that I'm coming from a lot of it is based on sort of questioning how much that's really relevant to the kind of control that matters for more responsibility.
Mhm.
There are a
Yeah, I
lot of ways
agree.
of getting at that point. One of my favorites, and I think given your interest, you would appreciate this, comes from a paper named by Joshua Spencer called "What Time Travelers Cannot Do But Are Responsible For Anyway," where he imagines this sort of benevolent version of the grandfather paradox for time travel, where you go back in time and you see this guy about to fall off a building, and you don't know who he is. And you activate a safety net, and it turns out he was your grandfather. And so if you you couldn't have not done it, right? Because for
Uh-huh.
obvious time traveling reasons,
Right.
but nevertheless, intuitively, it seems like you are like it's a praiseworthy thing to do. I do want to get to constitutive luck, but first, I do just really quickly want to say I think that one maybe small, maybe significant nitpick with something you said very early in your opening statement was about you know um, thinking that what was at stake. I mean, you said a couple different things, but the one I want to hone in on right now is thinking that what was at stake has to do with whether people deserve praise or blame. And I want to maybe put a little bit of distance between the deserving question, right? If like what it means to deserve praise and blame is like you deserve to be praised, you deserve to be blamed, that like there's some sort of reactive attitude that we're exhibiting towards you, or maybe even just that we're feeling towards you, or that we're acting on it in some way. Because I think all of that, I think, is a slightly different question from I think what we really typically mean by praiseworthy or blameworthy, which is more just like that you have, your action is such that these attitudes would fit, right? That they would make sense, right? So in other words, it could, it's not necessarily that you have a moral obligation to be mad at somebody, that that they or to have some sort of bad thought about them, or even to act on them, right? It's just that it wouldn't be sort of incoherent to have those attitudes in a certain kind of way. Like Ryan uses this analogy, that dissertation I've always really liked, to heartbreak. It's not that it's not that you have it's not that you have like an obligation to feel heartbroken, right? Because someone you love has left you. It's just that this is an attitude that would fit the situation, right? So that's
Mhm.
one thing I want to say. Now, as to what kind of control that you need, for that to happen, and then if we have it, we could have a whole discussion about, what the consequences of this are for, all sorts of interesting issues that you've raised in the last few minutes, ranging from meritocracy to, punishment, other things. Uh, but um, but I would just say I think that the whole constitutive luck thing, to my mind, is a bit question begging, because because say, well, it does seem to kind of be saying, well, how do you escape from the fact that the requirements of the free will means free from luck account aren't being met? And I'd say, well, I don't escape from that. I just dispute the fact that I just dispute the assertion that those are the relevant requirements, right? So, like, again, we agree that causal influence is not enough, is not the kind of control that matters for moral responsibility. But then you contrast that to robust control, and so I think the real disagreement we're having is what kind of control counts as sufficiently robust for moral responsibility.
Yeah, and I was curious specifically about where you said that you felt like there was something in between these things that was distinct, avoided the problem of constitutive luck, and could ground moral responsibility. Can you help me understand
Yeah, yeah.
what that looks like?
So again, I don't think it avoids the problem of constitutive luck, because again, I kind of think that's
Oh,
question begging, right? I think that they have a,
okay.
I
Yeah.
so
So let me address the question begging for a second here then.
okay. I do want to.
Okay,
I
sure.
do want to just say, just to maybe rephrase my claim, if that makes it clearer, right? I think there are various senses in which somebody could be said to be in control of their actions, right? That like would all maybe kind of like latch on to some aspect of how we might use words like control or can or ability or whatever, right? I think there's like a pretty broad range there, and some of them that we have, even if determinism is true, some of them we clearly can't, right? So what you're calling, causal influence, yeah, that's a kind of control that we have, but I think we agree it's not a kind of control that's sufficient for moral responsibility. But what you're calling robust control is, control in the sense of, you're free from luck through all your ancestors on both sides of the family leading up to the decision. And I simply deny that that is the kind of control that is important for moral responsibility. I think that a kind of control can be a robust control without being that kind of control. I think that, you're right. There is this very widespread cross-cultural intuition that you need some sort of control, over your actions in order to be responsible for them. One thing we may disagree about is whether there's a widespread intuition that you that you need to have, this sort of control, not over only over your actions, but over, certain facts about your character that, are in the background if you acted that way, etc. In order for you to be responsible for your actions. That seems like the second claim seems like a really significant extension of the first to me, and I guess I just want more of an
Okay.
argument for it.
Yeah. So, okay, let me try to lay out more of an argument. So, we both agree that causal influence is insufficient. So, we're looking for some version of robust control, right? What's required there? Well, so there I turn to the luck infection thesis, right?
Mhm.
For you to be free of luck, it seems like there can't be luck in the causal chain. How do you avoid having luck in the causal chain? Well, if you had causal influence over every step of the causal chain, that would guarantee that it was not the result of luck, right? So that would be one way to, it seems like, avoid the luck infection problem. Um, I'm open to there being an alternative account of control that also avoids the luck infection problem, but I haven't seen it, and I haven't heard one yet from you. So I guess my view is, until I have an alternative, it seems like the only possible way that we could avoid this problem would be the kind of robust control that I'm describing, the causal dominance account. And I don't think this begs the question, because I think this just follows from, Nagel in his chapter pre-butts the kind of you're begging the question argument by saying, look, I'm deriving this directly from the control condition, and I am showing that the control condition requires something more than causal influence.
How?
Um,
Well,
but
I mean, okay, the sentence ended with more than causal influence, and I agree
yes,
it requires more than causal influence.
right. It
But
requires
they
more
have,
than
but
causal influence. And if we take seriously the problem of constitutive luck, which is to say, if we take seriously that all of the features of you are beyond your control, because they are, going back to things that we unambiguously agree are beyond your control, like things that happened in your childhood, and that the lack of control from there carries forward. What you need is an argument that severs the line of luck. You need some sort of way to cut the line and say, here's where you became responsible. And I don't think you have any account of control that can provide for that line, it seems to
okay,
me.
I'm not convinced that any of that establishes that there is a problem there that needs to be responded to. I don't think it falls for the control condition, right? The control condition is a control condition on actions. Now, the claim that you only truly have control over your actions if you have control over everything that led to those actions is just a really substantial further claim. Now, you could rephrase that claim by calling it luck infection, by
Well,
calling it
so
luck
do you reject
infection.
the luck infection thesis, or
Oh, yeah.
how do
I
you?
mean, I think I said that explicitly in my opening statement.
Oh, sorry.
I
So can you give an explanation for how you would reject it, or
because
a
I
counter argument?
because I just don't see. I haven't heard an argument for it. I've just heard the assertion of it. They have a that so. I mean I've heard the assertion of it rephrased a few different ways, but I haven't heard a reason why we should
Okay,
pick it. The closest I've
sure.
heard is we have, well, we agree causal influence isn't enough. We need something more robust than causal influence, and this would be a thing that's more robust than causal influence. But the problem with
Okay.
that argument would be that there's lots of other stuff that would be more robust than mere causal influence that doesn't go as far as you need 100% ancestral freedom from luck. And I just don't know why. I just don't know what the reason is to think that the only account of control, I mean, because without that reason, to think the only account of control that could capture this control, this control condition intuition is this 100% ancestral luck freedom. Without that, then saying, like, how do you, answer the constitutive luck problem feels to me a little bit like just saying, like, well, look, how do you answer the problem of the fact that, even if everything you say is true, our actions still arise from a reasons responsive mechanism, and that's what's required for free will. It's like, well, that's not a problem. I've just sort of said that you don't think that meeting my conditions is sufficient, the same way that I'm saying I don't think meeting your conditions is necessary.
Okay, so let me see if I can try to motivate this here. So, in Kaufman's paper where he lays out the luck infection thesis, he argues against it, for example, by presenting a case where he suggests, let's say I left my work 5 minutes early because I got lucky and got out early. And because
Mhm.
I got lucky and got out early, I got to my kids' school 5 minutes early, and I was there to save their life from getting hit by a car, right? He claims that this example refutes the luck infection thesis by proving that that is not an instance of luck. And his argument there is, once I'm in that position, it's guaranteed that I'm going to try to save my child and succeed in doing so. So for some reason, that event itself doesn't count as luck. Now, I'm curious to hear your intuitions about this example, because it seems to
Mhm.
me that saving the child is incredibly lucky. That if he had been in
Mhm.
the opposite situation where he had arrived 1 minute late and watched his child get hit by a car and die, that would be the least lucky thing that could possibly happen to a parent. So it seems
Mhm.
bizarre to me to say that the alternative isn't luck. And similarly, it seems bizarre to me to say it's not, or that it's bad luck if someone doesn't happen to have the right constitution to act morally. And maybe we won't hold them responsible. Maybe you'll agree with me that we can't blame them for not acting morally. You'll reject that side and only keep the side where you think that we can hold people responsible when they act correctly, in which case we're just positively reinforcing people.
Mhm.
And there, like, it's less harmful, but it still is harmful in that I don't. Well, here's what I'll say. I actually psychologically do not think that you can separate these two things. I don't think that you can manage to only praise people and not implicitly blame and punish individuals for failing to act morally, either psychologically or in your mechanisms, essentially. And I think that trying to maintain either inevitably leads you to the kind of meritocratic hellhole
Okay.
that we're all living in.
Well,
Yeah. Okay.
I do want to get into that last part. So,
Sure.
and yeah, I think actually it'd be
But
good to
like, yeah, I would love
it'd
to
be
hear
good it'd
first
be
if you
good
have an
to
account of control that you feel like
sure.
addresses the
Yes,
problem.
yes. Okay. Well,
If you think there, I mean, like, or how you feel like you
sure,
actually
sure,
object to the
sure,
problem, because
sure,
I guess I'm not hearing a robust response to
sure. Well,
the luck infection thesis.
this is why I worry that we might be getting into a little bit of a rut
Mhm.
here in this part of the argument because I think that I still haven't heard an argument for it. Right? I mean, what I've heard is that there's this.
Do you think it's lucky that he saves the child? Let me ask you your
Yeah,
intuitions on that.
perhaps. I mean, like, I think that
Well,
the
I need a hard answer
I
here,
think
my friend. Was it a
well,
yes or
actually,
no?
I don't really know that I have a definite intuition on that case
Okay.
based on having heard it the first time 2 minutes ago. I have that's the
Okay.
I mean, I think that part of the problem here is that the word luck is profoundly ambiguous. It can mean about 100
Oh,
different things,
well,
and
we've
they
already
have a
defined it in terms of control. It's
okay, well,
the robust control
but the
account. Okay,
problem
so
is
let me
that
make clear, right?
control is
Luck is
equally
defined.
ambiguous.
Well, I don't think so. I think I've
Okay,
disambiguated into causal influence and robust control, and I think I've
but I
given
just
one.
but I
I've given one reasonable account of robust control. You said there could be another one, but you haven't presented it
yes, I
yet.
did actually.
Okay, what
That
was
was
it? Excuse me. I
one
apologize.
of the first things I did was present it
Okay, okay. So
in
what you mean is the
my
responsiveness, right? You mean
yeah,
responsiveness,
in
right?
my opening
Okay.
statement, right? So,
Okay, so it's
okay,
possible that we
so
fundamentally
my
disagree that whether
yeah,
or
my
not the response. Well, so let me ask. Sorry, let me ask it this way then.
sure.
How, okay. So maybe we end up going in circles because your view is the responsiveness objection answers, or that the constitutive luck isn't a real problem, and so the responsiveness objection is sufficient. That to me just seems like a refusal to engage with the problem as
Well, I
presented.
mean, I just haven't heard a good reason to think it's a problem. I think that
Okay.
they have a
So I guess I feel like I have
I've
presented a good reason, and it's just
okay,
possible that
okay.
we're not going to be able to agree on whether there is a
Might
good
not be
reason. Yeah.
possible, but like let me
Mhm.
just try one more time before we move
Sure.
on. And I would like to do, as I said, because I think we are veering into territory where we're getting a little wheel spinny. So, like, I would like to go into
Sure. Yeah.
some of the other things you raised about meritocracy and other issues. But I would just say briefly, right? My position is that, look, luck means absence of control. And I think control, is incredibly ambiguous. I think that there are many, many, many different things that control can mean. I think that there are lots of different senses in which you can either have or lack control over something, and they have so my claim in the opening statement um, is that saying, well, you can either have mere causal influence. In other words, it could either be that the only sense in which you're in control is that your decision is plays the right role in the chain of cause and effect. That they if you decided differently, something different would have happened. And then what you're calling robust control, which is the kind of control that's ancestrally free of luck, and so I agree that those are two different kinds of control. I agree that the first one would be insufficient for moral responsibility. I agree that the second one is not something that's plausible to think, to think exists. That they that But I think that there are a bunch of options in between. I gave one, which is that, I mean, it clearly is. I mean, whether you agree or disagree that it's sufficient for moral responsibility, it clearly is just a further claim from causal influence, right? That they have
I
a
would describe it as the causal influence that's caused in the right kinds of ways, right? That's the added
okay,
condition is there that your causal
fair,
influence is proceeding from the right kind of forces.
sure, but they
Would
have
you
a
agree with?
but
I'm just curious. Would you agree with that though? At least.
I don't think I think that's fine. I think that they
Okay.
have so in other words, like, so one kind of control is just like your decisions cause the action. Another kind of control is your decisions cause your action and they were brought about in a certain sort of way, right? And the and so the second claim is just a much, is just a different claim than the first one, right? It's a further claim, right? That they have a you're claiming something that's not being claimed the first time. And so that is a kind of control that's not the first kind of control. Now, it's the given the content of the specific way in which it has to come about, according to this kind, it's a kind of control that falls well short of the ancestral freedom from like anything else that you're not in control of, kind of control. And so now the issue is no longer just like is mere causal influence enough for moral responsibility, and if not, do we have this other thing? It's is this second thing sufficient for moral responsibility?
That's always been the case, though. I mean, I always would have said there are three positions. There are only
Sure,
two definitions of cult control, but there are three positions, right? There's the naive. Think of it this way, right? There's causal influence. There's causal influence plus, or
sure.
another version of robust control, and then there's my version of robust control.
Which is also causal influence plus. I mean, that's a yeah, that's that's still saying that
Sure, right, right,
that the decision caused it and was
right.
brought about in the right way. We're just
Right.
disagreeing about what the right way is, right? So the
Right.
point,
So, right, the fundamental disagreement is whether or not you need a causal influence, whether or not you take the constitutive problem seriously and therefore need a kind of robust control that goes beyond merely having the right kind of constitution. I do think that is our fundamental disagreement. So, like, I would never have suggested that you only wanted causal influence. Obviously thought that you all
sure,
were closer to a middle position between just causal
sure,
influence and my version of robust control. I don't think that that position makes
sure.
sense if you take the problem of luck that far, but then stop. I guess.
Okay, so I don't see how we're taking any problem of luck to any point and then stopping. I think I'm just like starting off by saying that
I think if you didn't take the problem of constitutive and circumstantial luck, or of circumstantial and consequential luck seriously, you wouldn't need to adopt a deflated account of robust control,
well,
or
I don't think it's
okay, you wouldn't need to adopt your version of free will. You could adopt a much stronger version, it seems to me, where you could say, we're going to hold you responsible for even more things beyond just the things that issue from the right kind of character, for example.
I mean, I don't think it fits with our, ordinary intuitions about, moral responsibility, like, insanity,
I mean, but
cuts
lots
against.
of people do think that you can
Okay.
ordinarily hold someone responsible for bad behavior, even if they didn't choose to be a bad person.
Um, yeah, including so let's back up a little bit here. So they have
Mhm.
a
Mhm.
so the intuitions that I'm trying to capture, right? In other words, if the question is why do I think that it's not just that your act is caused by your decision. I also think the right account includes your decision having to be caused a certain way. I think that it's the best explanation for certain sorts of basic intuitions about children, about insanity, about things like that, right? Those are the kinds of things that
Mhm.
are driving me to adopt that. And so
Mhm.
I think that they have, and so I think that the question of whether I mean I think just sort of at like in the example that you gave earlier, you were saying, well, does this refute the claim that they're luck infection? And I say, well, I mean that sort of I think smuggles in the idea that this is at least something we should believe as a default unless we have a reason not to believe it, and that's what I've been questioning all along, right? I think that I think whether or not it refutes it, like I just is not going to be interesting to me until I have a reason to believe it. And given that we have various senses of control on the table, right? That here are various kinds of control, and then and we have apparently your intuition is that we would need what seems to me like a kind of hyperbolic idea of control that doesn't really seem to be connected to our ordinary intuitions about moral responsibility, but like I just don't see that the fact that the kind of control that I think is relevant falls short of that kind of control as a problem. And I'm also a little bit skeptical that that it's that just sort of asking yourself, like thinking about some situation and asking yourself whether it's a case of luck or whether someone was lucky or unlucky is a useful procedure, because I think that there are lots of kinds of control. I mean, you're lucky or unlucky if there's one of these that you lack, right? But I think that just sort of saying, oh, I can identify a sense in which I'm not in control here, I think isn't really important until we've asked the further question: is the sense that I lack the kind that matters for moral responsibility? And to answer that
I think
question,
I
I
thought
think
we set that out at the beginning is my like, I guess I'm confused because I'm willing if you just wanna say you strongly reject the intuition that luck infects things and that constitutive luck is in any way actually a real problem. I do think that there are plenty of examples that suggest that it is, and I've tried to present a couple of them here. I think in general, you and I are sympathetic on, like, quite a few of them, and we could talk about, the implications in pedagogy, for example, in terms of, I don't think, for example, you believe that, like, a child doesn't deserve to, continue in education because they just don't work hard enough, for
uh,
example, right? Like, I think there are ways in which you acknowledge the realities of the pervasiveness of luck and want to ameliorate its effects, and so I think there's a little bit of a trying to, like, have a cake and eat it too kind of situation here. I think that I have given an account of control that would avoid what seems to me to be the serious problem. I don't think that the reflexive account provides an alternative. So, like, for example, if you had a young individual who never achieves the reflexive account because of a lifetime of
mm,
childhood abuse or something,
mhm.
I think that you consider that an extenuating circumstance to some
Well,
extent, right?
that's an entailment of the view.
Right, but what I'm saying is once you allow that entailment, it covers everything, right?
No,
There's no way to
but
stop that from spreading to every, like, so basically, like, for example, in Dennett's Elbow Room book, he
yeah.
says, we're going to draw a line between genuinely exculpatory causes and non-exculpatory causes, and I don't think you have any way to successfully draw that line without essentially ignoring the problem and just kind of hedging along conventional wisdom lines, and then I think you end up with a system that's unjust towards a lot of people.
Okay. So, but the problem is the reason that my view entails that person is responsible isn't your reason, right? It's a different reason, right? The reason that my view entails that person is responsible isn't that it doesn't have anything to do with the way in which their lack of this capacity came about. It's just that they lack this capacity. and and the claim is that this is the capacity, that's the kind of control that's relevant to moral
But you are
responsibility.
still saying that they have the kind of control that's relevant to moral
No,
responsibility.
I'm saying they don't, because the way you laid it out, they don't, right? You said that because the way they're brought up, etc., they don't have the
So am I
capacity or
correct that on
responsibility.
your view, no one deserves to be punished? Like no one who acts immorally is morally responsible?
Okay. Uh, so I think the punishment question is a further question. I'm happy to talk about it. I think that I do not think.
No, no, yeah, let's talk about it. Let's do it right now. I think
Well,
it's the crux of our debate here, right? Like
let's
that
not.
this is
Well,
exactly the
this is.
concern.
I don't think it is exactly a concern. This is where I started by saying that the issues should be separated. I think that what it entails for punishment is an interesting question, but I think it's just a different question from whether it's true.
I feel
I
like
do
there should be a straightforward
I do
answer to
think
this
that people.
question. I'm
Well,
confused.
I don't, because I think it's complicated. But before we go on to punishment and meritocracy, I do want to get Silver Harlow's super chat. So Silver says the most unlucky thing that can happen to a parent. I guess this is an objection earlier, so I'll just let you take this. Mixed common sense kind of luck with your technical sense of luck, and then I guess the further claim is something about I don't know if this is what Silver's getting at, but like that there's like a sort of emotional reaction to it that might make that distinction unclear. I'm not 100% sure what Silver's getting at here, but you can
I think
take
this
the
was in
question however
reference
you want.
to the child example, that it was too emotional
Okay,
an example.
sure.
Other examples that are used are things like sunrise, as an attempt to reject the kind of account that I have in mind. And this one is, I think, more supportive of your position intuitively, because more people think that intuitively the sunrise isn't luck. But on my view, I think sunrises are lucky. Like I think any time when you're living on a planet that has a stable sunrise like ours that allows for life, you are more lucky than, for example, living on that planet when the sunrise stops because the sun expands and consumes the planet. Like we don't think of it as being lucky, but I think it actually is lucky because of the same infection thesis. It follows from the same lucky causes that led to our own existence, and so is infected by that same kind of luck. So I can use very mundane examples to make the claim. I really do think everything is luck all the way down, and I don't think that's either a mysterious or an implausible idea, and it does have really genuine consequences, and that's why a lot of people try to deny that it's true.
Well, I don't. I mean, I think I don't deny that it's true. I just deny that it's relevant to the sense of
Sure,
control.
I was saying
That's
other people deny that it's true
sure,
entirely, right? You
sure,
deny that it's
sure.
relevant, but I think that's a different argument.
Sure.
Right.
I mean, like at least insofar as I understand what you're saying, when you say luck is all the way down, I think what
Mhm.
you're saying is that there aren't any decisions that are ancestrally free of luck, and all the way back through the chain of cause and effect,
Sure.
which I,
Events, but yeah.
sure, which is true, right? And I'm fine with saying that that's true. I think that okay, so I am going to so I do want to pivot, because we said it was going to be an hour, and it's already been an hour, and we haven't even really talked about any of these other issues. So I do want to pivot to some of those other issues. So two in particular that you mentioned that are important are punishment and meritocracy. Uh, so um, so I and and I think you kind of bristled earlier when I said that I think that the free will question and the punishment question are separate. What I mean by that
Mhm.
is not that I don't think that that what one thinks about one could have implications about the other. I just think that I just think that, like, to sort of get to those, I just don't think it's a very direct implication. I think that
Mhm.
I think that these are like pretty substantially separate issues. That there are certain views about punishment that you can't make sense of if you don't believe in free will, maybe. But
Sure,
the
but there are certain views
but
that make no sense if you reject the idea of free will, like
sh-
retributive punishment, right? I think we
sure,
agree on that. So in
sure.
that way, they're conceptually directly
So
connected, right?
yeah, right, but the sense in which they're not directly connected is that there's no logical entailment whatsoever for belief in free will and responsibility. Therefore, you have to believe in retributivism, right? I mean, that they have a
No, of course not. Right.
it's only the other way around, right? So in other words,
Right.
it
What I
could
would argue
it
is
could
that if you believe in free will, you are more likely to believe in retributivism, but not necessarily
sure.
likely.
Sure. I mean, right. I mean, if you're, I mean, if you're if you're an atheist, you're less likely to believe in Catholicism, but that doesn't mean that,
I'm not
like,
sure that comparison tracks, but okay.
well, well,
Yeah.
well, well, the sense in which it does is you have to be a theist to be a Catholic, but but just the fact that you're a Catholic by itself doesn't tell us anything. The fact that you're a theist by itself doesn't, you can't be a Catholic without being a theist, but the mere fact that you're a theist doesn't tell us anything yet about whether you're a Catholic, right?
Okay.
And so
It's
similarly,
okay. I'm more concerned about the punishment question anyway. I'm really just curious about how
well,
your position addresses this question.
well, okay. I don't think it has to, because I think that they have a because I think it could be, no, I mean, because it could be that
Okay.
the right view of punishment could be. I don't think it is, right? But I think that it could be the right view of punishment doesn't entail anything about free will. Now, I am, what's true about punishment? Well, like you, I am not a retributivist. I think that I am somewhat drawn towards like restorative justice kinds of views, which I think are also hard to make sense of if you don't believe in moral responsibility. Because
I'm curious to hear why on that front, because I don't fully
sh-
understand.
sure. So I think that I think that the idea that you owe something to someone, because of what you have done to them. Now, it's certainly true that it could be possible for you to have done something wrong without being responsible for it. I actually completely agree on that point, but I think that it makes less sense to say, that if it is completely out of your hands what you did wrong, that therefore you still sort of owe the same
Okay.
to the person you have wronged as you would without it. Also, I do want to say, while we're on punishment, that they
Sure.
have that I think one of if we are again not on the subject of is free will real, but we're on the subject of what are the moral and political consequences of free will being real or not. One concern that I've always had about that is that I think that it's very difficult to make sense. I mean, maybe if you can do restorative justice without free will, maybe you can get around this. But I think that on the face of it, I think a lot of people who are free will skeptics, right, end up saying like super utilitarian things about punishment. Like they say, oh, it's like quarantining plague victims, stuff like that. And I think on those sorts of views, certainly, it's very hard to make sense of a lot of important intuitions about why a liberal and humane justice system that errs on the side of the rights of criminal defendants is better than one that doesn't. Because if we're just sort of looking at good and bad consequences, then it's not at all obvious that it's going to shake out that way. And I think a lot of those sort of core intuitions about like Blackstone's ratio, it's better to it's better to imprison. It's better to set free, 10 guilty people than to imprison one innocent person. I think if we're just sort of looking at sheer good and bad consequences, that's not at all obvious. If, on the other hand, we think that there's some sort of moral imperative that it's really important not to imprison innocent people, or it's not really important not to, drone bomb innocent people or whatever, then that I think it could actually be so important that even if the overall consequences for the world are better if we do, we shouldn't do it. I think if you sort of lose sight of the moral importance of that distinction, the moral importance of innocence, which I think is a risk of free will skepticism, then I think it's very hard to make sense of all that. So I think that's one example of a place where I think the political valence of denied free will might go in a different direction than people often assume it would. I think that
Okay.
I think the
Could I get in
meritocracy
on some
one
of
is
these? If you want?
what is too. But having said my piece about punishment, I'll go to you.
Okay. So, for I do want to note it's still sort of unclear to some extent if you've answered the question of whether someone deserves to be punished on your view if they act poorly or not. But I understand maybe you feel like that's another separate question. I think they are fundamentally connected here. So let me respond to a few things there. Um, the concern about how to justify restorative justice on my model, certainly there's a kind of naive form of restorative justice that looks a lot like retributive justice, but more gentle or something, right? Where it's like two people come together and they talk about how one person deserves to be punished because they did a bad thing and they decide on a punishment and they punish them, right? I don't think that's actually the best model. I think there are much better models of restorative justice that aren't about necessarily assigning praise or blame in any kind of way. It's about coming together in community and recognizing that an immoral thing happened and figuring out how as a community to fix that in a way that is mutually beneficial and respectful. And none of that, I think, at all requires anything like robust control or anything like that. In fact, I don't think, aside from the retributive intuitions about morality. I don't think any of the fundamental moral principles are damaged on my view. I think we can maintain not just utilitarianism intuitions, but non-consequentialist ones. I think we can maintain virtue ethics and care ethics on my view. They all make good sense, and I think they pretty effectively would pull in the other direction. So I think there's good reason to, based on the psychological evidence, to believe that on my view, there is greater compassion, more humility, and less desire to see people punished. And as a result,
Do you see?
you have. Mhm.
Do you see, like, in the way of understanding restorative justice you laid out, do you think that it makes a difference whether this bad thing was done by, for example, a criminally insane person, or by somebody who's not insane? For what
It matters for the purposes of figuring out how to solve the problem, but not for assigning moral responsibility. So
well,
you made a comment there
okay,
about the innocence of persons, right? On my view, everybody's an innocent, right? There
mhm.
is no
Right,
such
I
thing
understand that,
as a
yeah,
non-innocent person, and
right.
that's why we have to respect we have to be concerned about the well-being of everyone, not just the people who act correctly. And so what I would
I
say is in the
think
case of
we
like
should be
yeah,
concerned with the well-being of everybody. I think you could
right.
I think you can think that somebody matters and we should be compassionate towards them, while also thinking that there is a morally relevant difference, right? That they have a that like that is a morally important difference between, locking somebody up,
What do you think is
uh,
the benefit of emphasizing that morally relevant difference if
because
other
the
than
what I laid
other
out
than
earlier.
oh, so let me ask, what's the like, I guess it seems to me, I'll say the only reason
Mhm.
we do that is actually because it serves as a proxy for trying to figure out what the best way is to deal with this person,
Okay,
right? If
I don't think so. I think that I just gave you a reason that's very different from that why it would be important, which is that they have a which is that, I think that that difference helps us make sense of stuff like Blackstone's ratio. That in other
but
words,
we don't need it to make
they
sense of Blackstone's
I
ratio.
think we do, right? Like
Why?
now, because
I'm not sorry, I'm not understanding why,
so
because
sorry,
it
because they
seems like you're claiming that my view is gonna make people more consequentialist, and I'm saying, "No, it doesn't," and the reason is because we can justify belief in flourishing and all these other, we can be
sure.
in favor of a rehabilitative
So
model. So, like
prison
yeah.
stops people prison stops people from flourishing in certain ways, and we should be concerned about that regardless of who's in prison. But they have a but if we're not making any distinction between innocent people being imprisoned and other people being imprisoned, and all we're concerned about is, well, there's this bad thing that there are people in prison, and then maybe we've got another bad thing over here, which is the rate of crime that's going on or something like that. They I think that you do have a problem of explaining why is it that there is this morally significant difference between those two bad things, where the badness of putting an innocent person in prison overwhelms like these tremendous games. And if you think
I'm
innocence
sorry. Yeah, I'm not saying it overwhelms it in all cases, though.
if you think innocence is like not important, or like essentially you think everybody's innocent, right? Like, I mean, I think this gets to the meritocracy thing too, right? Because I think the structure of my worry is going to be the same in both cases. That that they have a that the reason, right, the sort of intuitively powerful case against meritocracy is that it's absurd, to think that it's to think that it's justifiable for some people to have more than others because of talents, because those talents are outside of their control. And if nothing that anybody ever does is inside of their control, I think that loses a lot of, I think that loses a lot of its sting. I think that they have a that calling attention to
Why
particular
doesn't it
crime.
make it stronger?
So, well, I would
Because look, I
so
mean,
so look, if it's well, hold on. I was saying, right? I
sorry,
mean,
I'm trying to catch up some of these comments before we run out of time. So but yeah, go
sure.
ahead. Finish up your thought.
So, yeah, I mean, I think if everybody is innocent, then saying, "Oh, it would be particularly bad to imprison this person because they're innocent," we can, no longer, at the very least, we have a problem about, we have to like translate that thought into some other terms or something like that, because we haven't called attention to a fact that's true about some people, not others. If everything is outside of your control, then just saying, well, it's bad to reward talent because talent is outside of your control, you haven't pointed out something that would be true of some things and not others. It's everything's just kind of on the same level, right? Like every
Hmm.
time anybody
Yeah.
has anything that anybody doesn't have for any reason, then it's all on the same level. And I think that does really cut away at the moral outrageousness of people of inequalities that trace back specifically to some specific things, which we can make sense of if we say those specific things are things that are outside of people's control. That's why those inequalities are a problem. Like if we just
Hmm.
if I just like you know if I just like money more and you like free time more, right? And I work more hours a day, and you work less, right? Then there's nothing objectionable about that inequality, right? It arises purely out of free choices. But if you have an ability to do something that I don't have, then there's something morally outrageous about an inequality that rises back to to that. So I mean, my worry in both cases, the structure of the worry is that if you say it's like saying everybody is guilty, nobody is guilty, right? If everything is outside of your control, we lose our ability to it takes all of the moral force, it takes all of the wind out of the sails of the argument that we could point to particular social practices and say those are bad because those are outside of people's control, because you think everything's outside of your control. You think who you're married to is outside of your control, and what and how many hours you're working is outside of your control, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like, if somebody is married to somebody they didn't choose to be married to, that's a problem, right? That's outside of their
But
control.
that's
They
that's
have
easily explainable on my view.
Okay,
Right. So, for example, on my view, I can easily explain why it is good to give people the kind of, what you would call, reflexive responsiveness, right? I can justify saying that reflexive responsiveness is a good thing because it contributes to flourishing, for example. If you have the ability to act responsively, you are more likely to promote flourishing and less likely to cause suffering. And those are good things on my view. I just recognize that whether you actually have it or not is the result of luck. So it's not
mhm.
impossible at all for me to
Oh, I agree with
substantiate
that.
the actual intuitions that you want to substantiate. I just don't see any value in some of the things you're trying to substantiate because, like, I think they just inevitably just lead to punishing people who don't deserve it in ways that make no sense. And I think that it ultimately, your view does entail that people who act wrongly deserve the negative consequences that we ascribe to them.
Absolutely does not entail that.
As far as look, as far as I can tell, I can't see how it avoids that. And I feel like it's been hard to get clear on how the reflexive responsiveness view answers a straightforward question like, do bad people deserve to be punished because they are bad? And if they
Okay.
don't, then doesn't that concede the point in my favor? And we're on to discussing the
Nope.
other reasons that we punish them. Because look, I'm all in favor, and I don't think we actually should be punishing people. I think we should be thinking about it in terms of helping them, right? And I don't think that
Yeah.
we should be thinking about that in a naively not, authoritarian kind of way. We can still respect the reflexive responsiveness version of agency. None of these things, it seems like, are a problem for my view. So I struggle to understand what exactly you really feel like I can't secure on my view that is securable on your view, that outweighs what I think are the costs that come from holding some people responsible in the way that you want to.
Okay, so I think it's just straightforwardly false that it follows from thinking that some people are responsible and think they deserve to be punished. I think that there are lots of different views about punishment that are consistent with this. I already gave one example. Another one is the sort of two-level view that, like, Dworkin suggests in certain places, which is that you have a sort of default right against punishment that you can lose by doing certain things that you're morally responsible for, but having lost that right against it is not the same as deserving for it to happen. It could be, and in fact, in many cases, doubtless is the case that there's no positive good that would be served by punishment. And so, in that case, the mere fact that you don't have this right against it isn't a good enough reason to be punished. That's another possible view about punishment, along with the one that
Do
I
you
gave
do you agree
earlier.
with that?
That's all. that's all consistent
I'm
with
just
it.
trying to
Well,
understand which
I
one
just
you actually adopt, though.
so,
No, I mean,
so right,
I
right.
agree there are ways you could go, but you need to adopt one, and then I can argue with
Well,
it.
actually, first of all, no, I don't, right? Because that's a
Okay,
separate argument.
sure.
It's just a further argument. They have what I'm arguing
I
for is
guess if we're
moral,
gonna get to the
is
consequences
moral,
of our views, though, we
well,
have to address
okay.
these questions, right?
I don't, so first question is, does moral responsibility exist? I think yes. Second question is if moral responsibility exists, what theory of punishment is true? We've got a bunch of options. Now, I said earlier that I'm very sympathetic to restorative justice views. I'm at the very least restorative justice curious. I think as far as exactly what the right one is, I think I mentioned a couple that that I think are not like crazily implausible. But again, I just think it's a further argument. You said that whether or not we have the capacity for reasons responsiveness is a matter of luck. I agree. So does everybody else, right? In other words, uh, nobody disagrees that you can, that people have, that whether people have or
Mhm.
lack this capacity is a matter of luck. I mean, look, even if you believe in the mysterious, spooky, contra-causal version of free will, right? They have I think everybody agrees that if through no fault of your own, your brain is hit by lightning or something, and you lose this capacity, right? That's just bad luck. They have so I think everybody agrees whether you have the capacity is a question of luck. The point of substantive disagreement is
Mhm.
whether if you have that capacity, if you're lucky enough to have that capacity and you act on it, you're therefore responsible for the actions. I think that's a substantive disagreement.
Right.
As far as why it matters, I think that again, I think that certainly in terms of ordinary intuitions about this stuff, I think that if we think there's something especially bad about inequalities in outcome that are outside of anybody's control. I think that if we're talking about some things but not others, I think that objection has some moral force to it that it just doesn't if no, everything is outside of everybody's control. There's nothing that it would be for anything to be inside anybody's control. Then there's nothing special and bad about things that are outside of your control. Like
But
one of
that's
your
just resolved by
examples
distinguishing between
in the
causal influence and robust control. That's why I
no,
distinguish between
it's
yeah, because
but it's
well,
not. It's
hold
not
on.
all resolved by that. It's not at all resolved by that. That's just straightforwardly false.
But I feel like 3 or 4 times now I've said I can perfectly ground the value of reflexive responsiveness and make a distinction between
Yes,
actions that are done
but
from a reflexive responsive position and not, and I've
I
explained
haven't
how I can ground that value.
but I haven't
Okay.
disagreed
I
that you could
okay.
that I haven't disagreed that you could explain why it's a good thing to have this capacity.
On my view.
On your view, sure.
Yeah.
That's fine. But I'm not disputing that. I don't think anybody's actually disputed that.
I'm confused what you're disputing.
I think
What
that
am I missing out here?
what we're disputing is not whether it's a good thing to have this capacity. What we're disputing is whether having this capacity is sufficient for moral responsibility. We're also disputing
Right.
the second thing we're disputing is whether some things counting as this kind of control is significant for thinking about stuff like meritocracy. Now they
Mhm.
have. I don't think that mere causal influence can capture why some things stand out as morally outrageous inequalities in ways that others don't. And I think the reason that it can't is that there are you know look, if somebody is deciding something as a child, if somebody has decided something and they're insane, if somebody is deciding something, they have certain kinds of really profound developmental disabilities, then I think that that is intuitively something that is not under their control in precisely the sense of control that's going to be relevant when we say inequalities are objectionable when they trace back to things that are outside of your control. But mere causal influence isn't going to capture that distinction because the insane person, the child, etc., are all going to
Yeah,
have
I think you're
causal
misconstruing
influence
my
in
position
exactly
still.
the same way as
So
you or
let
I
me try to
do.
clarify my position because I think you're misconstruing it here,
Okay.
right? So I make a conceptual distinction between
Mm,
causal influence and robust control. I do
mhm.
not think these are the only two accounts of free will. They're the only definitions of control that we need to make all of the distinctions between the different versions that we want to make. Okay. Then we lay out 3 different versions: just causal influence, causal influence that is produced by the right kind of person or character or system, your reflexive responsiveness model, and my robust control model, right? Those are three different models, right? What it sounds to me is you're saying I can't make sense of those three different models on my view
No,
and explain
it's
why
not what I'm
there's
saying.
wait. Well, hold on, let me finish, right? What it sounds
Mhm.
to me like you're saying is I can't distinguish between the situations where one has reflexive responsiveness and the situations where one has mere causal influence. So if that's not what you're saying, help me understand what the objection is.
Okay, so I think that I mean, okay, first of all, it's a little bit confusing because the first thing you said was the only two kinds we need to make sense. The only two kinds of
The only
control
two
we need.
definitions of control, yes, to make
Okay,
sense of the three definitions of free will.
and then you
Two
gave me
definitions of
then you
control,
get then you
three
gave me
definitions of free will. We're talking about two
okay,
different
but
concepts.
okay, I don't understand how you're distinguishing them. What I would understand as free will is whatever sense of control is relevant for moral responsibility. Now, I think that
Right. There are
you gave three different senses of control, which are all different from each other. They
no, I
each
gave
of
three different senses of free will using two versions of control because your
no,
version is causal influence
no,
that
it's
is
not.
produced in the right kind of ways, which is the right kind of further causal
But
influences.
that's but given the move you just made, robust
Yeah.
control is also just causal influence because robust control, as you've defined it, and by the way, I object to calling that robust. I think mine is robust, right? But I think that but robust control, as you're defining it, is just causal influence that's caused in the right way. You're just laid out
Right.
a
I just
different
think you
right
have to
way,
lay out
right?
a sufficiently robust kind of right way, and I think your version isn't sufficiently robust.
No,
That's
no,
the difference.
I
And like,
understand.
well, hold on, let me highlight. I
Well,
think you're 100% wait, I want to
hold on,
agree with you for a
hold on,
second.
Eric. Okay,
Let me agree with
I
you
do
for
want
2
to finish the
seconds.
point at some point, but okay.
Okay. Okay, but I feel like, you finished many, many points here, so let me just
Okay.
say, I think
I feel like I've been interrupted far more than I've interrupted, but okay.
I know, but I thought it was because, you wanted us to both have the conversation. So,
No, we wanted
I've
both to
tried
have
to
a
make it a
conversation.
dialogue. Okay.
I feel like I having a
Okay.
dialogue means that you get to, like anyway, whatever. Let's not do the meta debate about that. Let's just make
No,
your
let's
point.
not. So all I wanted to say was I think you're absolutely right that the crux of our debate is whether it's a problem that reflexive
Yes.
responsiveness is the result of constitutive luck. I think it's a problem. You
Okay.
don't. And I think at the end of the day, our audience can listen to the arguments and
Sure.
decide do they think that it is a problem or not. And I think that's fair for us to leave the argument at that point by saying, either you're compelled by my concerns or you're not. And if you're not, then Ben's position is a open position to you, right?
Okay. I think that I don't understand saying that there are only two definitions of control there. You've given three different kinds of control. They're all real kinds of control. And the real question we're having when we talk about which of them is what we would call free will is which of these kinds of control is important for moral responsibility. That's my position. They have
Hmm.
and you could call the second two, reasons responsiveness and ancestral luck freedom. You can call both of those causal influence if you want, because they both start with that and then add other conditions. But I think it's more useful to just say those are three different kinds of
Okay. If,
control.
if you want to prefer to characterize it that way, that's fine. I think that still makes it the case that this is our fundamental disagreement, then, right?
Um, so yeah, I think our fundamental disagreement is whether we need to go all the way to ancestral luck freedom to have a moral responsibility, or whether reasons responsiveness is sufficient for moral responsibility. Now, a further disagreement is about whether whether it's important, whether saying that nobody has a important kind of control, right? Saying that and basically we disagree. Your position is going all the way to what you're calling robust control. Okay, the difference between that and like bare causal influence, you think would be important, right? But you don't think the difference, at least, I mean, it might be a desirable thing to have for various reasons, right? But in terms of evaluating, whether somebody's decision is like their fault, because that's a concept, you wouldn't subscribe to anyway, right? Things like that. You wouldn't say that the difference between bare causal, bare causal influence And reasons responsiveness is an important difference. And I think that the difference about meritocracy is whether the idea that there's a important kind of that would, like, adults with normal cognitive capacities, et cetera, make decisions that they're where they're weighed reasons for and against their actions, et cetera, right? Like, whether the presence or absence of that kind of control is relevant to why certain kinds of inequalities are objectionable. I think it is relevant, to why they're objectionable. I think it's extremely intuitive that it would be relevant to why they're objectionable. I think if you told anybody, well, they
Can you
could.
say a little bit more about why you feel it's relevant? Yeah, I'm
Sure,
curious.
sure. I think that if you have, I think that if you think about sort of core cases of inequalities that we think are unjust, inequalities based on race, inequalities, based on caste, et cetera. I think a pretty plausible explanation of why those are particularly objectionable in ways that, just like, if we make a bet, and we're making even a somewhat foolish bet, right? We're betting too much money, and they have and I lose the bet, and now there's a big inequality between us, but that one doesn't feel as objectionable as inequalities based on things like racial background. And I think a fairly plausible explanation of why not, of what the difference is that one of those was under our control and one of them isn't. I think that's a pretty common idea. And they have and my further suggestion was that the kind of control that might be relevant here is reasons responsiveness. And one reason to suspect that that's the kind of control that's relevant is that I think that if somebody who we did, who was, small child, who was insane, who was, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, made that bet, right? I think that we would reasonably view that in a very different light from me making that foolish bet. And I think we would find the result much more objectionable in that case because we wouldn't think that they were capable of exercising the right kind of control.
Okay. So I think in this situation, we'd have to ask why you made the bet, right?
Hmm.
And I think the problem might be that your account is underdetermined on that side. So if we ask, for example, did you make the bet because you had a crippling gambling addiction,
Hmm.
right? And if the answer is yes, do you feel like we can hold you, or do you feel like that situation then becomes like the other situation?
Yeah, because I think crippling gambling addictions get in the way of your reasons responsive mechanism. I think that you're
Okay.
not properly responsive to reasons if you have a crippling gambling addiction, the same way that a heroin
So
addict getting their next fix isn't responsive to reasons.
so
It's
let's
not.
say
It's
that
it's it's
yeah,
not.
let
It's
me ask
not
you a
about
question
the
then. Okay,
further
sorry.
origin story. It's just about whether that relevant. They're in a position to exercise that capacity.
So if reasons responsiveness is what matters,
Hmm.
let's say that you make the bet because well, let me ask it this way. If we're assuming for the sake of argument that it's an unreasonable bet,
Hmm.
right? It's a bad idea bet, but you
Hmm.
make it anyway, and we're going to punish you for it, right? Or no, whatever. Sorry, so that's the punishment. We're just you make the bad bet, and you know it's a bad bet when you're making it. Are you acting reasonably in that situation?
If you know it's a bad bet, then maybe not. I mean, I think that now we might be
So how on
getting
your yeah, how
that, but
on your reason?
now we
Okay.
might be getting into a gray area, right? Because I mean, which, sorry, life is complicated. There are a lot of gray areas, right? Like they have a so
Yeah.
I think that like I think one of the first things I said about reasons responsiveness was that it's a spectrum, and that we're talking about threshold. And I think anytime you're talking about spectrums and thresholds, you're going to have fuzzy gray areas where it's not entirely
Okay.
clear which side they lie on. I think if you say it's a bad bet as you're making it, right? That already suggests like a certain degree of irrationality. I think that I think
Okay.
that whether it's a sufficient degree to, to get into to like obliterate responsibility, I think that's a much harder question.
Okay, so it seems to me that this isn't a gray area problem. It's an inability to use your principle problem here, right? Let me explain why. So, like, we have two possibilities, right? Either the person knows that the bet is unreasonable. So, we'll assume for sake of argument, it is an unreasonable bet. It's just a bad
Hmm.
idea. Either they know it's an unreasonable bet or they don't know it, right? Those are our
Hmm.
two options. If they know it's an unreasonable bet, then on your view, they're not acting reasonably and can't be held responsible. If they know or if they don't know that it's a reasonable bet, then on your review, they're not acting reasonable, because if they were being reasonable, they would know that it was an unreasonable bet. So they are not reflexively responsive to the fact that it is an unreasonable bet, and so cannot be held responsible. It's not clear to me how, in any version of this
Hmm.
situation, your view can hold somebody responsible. Can
Okay.
you sort of clear that up for me?
Sure. I think it's a false dichotomy. I think that the idea that you either know that or you don't know that. I think that the term is incredibly ambiguous. I think just reflection on day to day experience should show you that it's ambiguous. I think that you think.
Right, but I don't think the spectrum is going to solve the problem, right?
Okay, I
Anywhere
don't
on the
I don't I
spectrum
don't
is
I don't
still a
I don't
weird.
think
Go
there's a
ahead.
problem to be solved. I think that it's just that, you have a spectrum. I think that you have clear points where people are not capable, of understanding, and being moved by reasons. I think there are clear cases of that. I think there are clear cases of people who do have those capacities, and I think that
Mhm.
there are cases, and I think there are cases that are going to be gray area. Now, I think when you talk about knowing, and just because somebody is making an unreasonable decision, I don't think that necessarily is enough to show that it's I mean, like, people can, I think people could be dumb. I think people could,
How do we
people
determine
can.
reflexive responsiveness then? What's our way for deciding if somebody has sufficient criteria on your view to be held responsible? Do we look at their behavior? What are we looking at here?
Well, I think if we're just, again, I think that whether you understand and whether you're at least somewhat moved, by reasons is the definition. Now, I think it's fuzzy. I think there's going to be a Sorites problem here, that there are going to be a bunch of different degrees. And even when you talk about knowing that
I'm not worried
something,
about the degrees though. I'm worried about
uh,
how we
okay,
as a
but
culture
but
assess this fact,
but
right?
what I
Like,
but what I'm saying, right, is that they have is that I think the reason there isn't a clear example to your case is because we haven't said enough about it to say exactly where it lies on the spectrum. I think that there are lots of different senses in which you can kind of know that you're doing something irrational, but not be fully aware of it, etc. I think any human being should be able to reflect for 5 seconds and see that there is a huge spectrum there. Now,
so,
how do we as a culture assess it, right? Like,
uh-huh.
um, I think there are going to be limits on our ability to assess it, but I don't think that that means that there are no actionable results of all of this, right? I think that it is probably going to be true that there are going to be cases, maybe even lots of cases, maybe tons of cases, where we can't be sure whether something is under somebody's control or not. Fortunately, though, there are a lot of cases where we can be very sure about it, where that's very easy, where there's no ambiguity whatsoever. And since the struggle for justice is extremely long and difficult, we can start with those while we try to figure out the ones we're less sure of.
Right. So I guess what I'm saying is I think there's a fundamental problem of application here that would expand to every situation. So I'm trying to imagine in my
Mm.
head a scenario in which, on your view, we would hold someone responsible for the bet. We've agreed it's not the situation in which they very knowingly make an irrational bet because they don't meet the criteria, it seems like, or the alternative extreme position where they very definitely don't know. But that only leaves, like, what, a scenario where they kind of vaguely know that it's bad, but not enough that it actually drives their behavior. But that doesn't seem like a good way to hold them, a good reason for holding them morally responsible. So they have to know it enough that they can be held responsible, but not enough that it makes him irrational to act in that way. And I just don't think there's anywhere on the spectrum,
Well, I think
in
I,
any kind of spectrum, that would make sense like that. Like, it's not,
I,
it's
I
not a,
think.
it's not a gray area problem. I just think, hang on, let me
Oh,
just
I think
finish.
it is.
Oh, that's okay. I don't think it is. I think it's a problem in which Anywhere that you point to on the spectrum, they're either going to be far enough towards not knowing that it would feel weird, or they're going to be far enough towards knowing that it will feel weird. And trying to just assert that there is some sort of spot in the middle that avoids the problem, I don't think makes sense. And I think this expands out to ethics more broadly, where
Mm,
in reality, we either have to say that a person knowingly does wrong, in which case they are not reflexively responsive, or that they unknowingly do wrong, in which case they are also not reflexively responsive. The idea of like semi-knowing in just the right kind of way that you could justify holding them
yeah.
accountable is mysterious to me. So I guess I don't think I
Okay,
understand your position there.
okay, okay, sure. So let me see if I can clear it up. I think that I think that first of all, I think the idea there might not be any cases. There might be a relatively narrow range of cases where somebody makes like a wildly irrational bet where they're responsible is a pretty natural fit with my view, and I don't, and I also think it's a pretty natural fit with just ordinary views about this. If something's wildly
Okay.
irrational, then
We may just have very
that
strong
suggests
different intuitions here, I guess.
that suggests some degree, of impulsive behavior, et cetera. That would at least, whether it reduces it to the point of non-existence or not, that it's at least reductive of the extent to which you're acting this way. I think it may be a more interesting view case might be a rational bet, right? Controversies about option luck, often focus on these, right? Where somebody is, rolling the dice in a way that's rational, that they have enough to gain. Potentially, it's not an irrational thing to do, but they're doing it of their own free will. And maybe even later, they would say, "I don't regret doing that. It was worth the shot." I would also say that the reason I don't think it generalizes is because I think that you switch between two very important concepts, right? One is knowing that something is irrational, and the other is knowing that it's wrong. I think that the question of whether or not you know what you're doing is irrational speaks to how rational you're being, right? Whereas I think the question of whether or not you do something despite knowing that it's wrong only speaks to how moral you're being. And I think those are just very different concepts. I think that you could be, I think that you could act immorally. I think that you could have, I think that you could have pristine reasons responsiveness. You could be great at it, but just have terrible values and act immorally. And there's no particular problem there. I also wanted
Are you
to just,
responsible in that situation?
oh yeah, for sure.
So if you were unlucky and you were raised in a really terrible society
Hmm.
like the Nazi Germany,
Hmm.
and you grow up and you're really responsive to your Nazi values,
Hmm.
you don't have any concern about the constitutive luck that goes into that behavior?
Hmm. I can see the concern. I do think that but I do think that it's possible to just, to just have. I think having a bad character is just a different question, right? From having the capacity to reason. Now, I think that like I think to the extent that your point is okay, but also worry about this other thing, then fair enough, right? I mean, like that's a I don't want to
Yeah.
say it's not a
I mean, it's
real,
another part of constitutive luck, it seems to me, right? Your values?
sure, but I think that but I think that the idea that that you're not like the difference between them is one of them might be just a reason, like just a straightforward reason to reject the account, and fair enough. Like we could argue about whether, like we could sort of stack that up against the arguments for the account and see what wins. But I think that's a very different thing from I think what you were raising in the gambling case, which was a problem about how to tell whether the requirements of the account are even being met. And that one, I agree, there can be cases where there's a you have a hard time seeing if the requirements of the account are being met. But I also think there are going to be many cases where it's very easy to tell whether the requirements of the account is being met. Right? If somebody's born in Mexico and they can't enter into the United States, and I'm born in the United States, and I am allowed to come and go as I please, it's very clear whether that difference is a result of something that's under my control in the sense of control that I've laid out. Right? It clearly doesn't meet the requirements, so we have a clear case of injustice. I think in other cases, it might be much less clear. But again, my argument is going to be that we can at least focus on trying to fix the easily identified instances of injustice while we try to figure out the harder ones. I do just want to get in. I haven't been highlighting his earlier comments because for fear that it would seem too partisan. But I think Ryan is just making an interesting side point here. So I did want to bring this up on the screen. He says one thing that might help here is the distinction between acting rationally in a specific instance and acting as the result of capacities that are generally but imperfectly responsive to reason. Where I guess his idea, if I'm interpreting him correctly here, is that you could say that the requirement for being in control of your actions is that your actions result from the second thing, the capacities that are generally imperfectly but enough responsible to reason, um, and that's compatible with the idea that individual decisions might be very irrational, but you can still be. I think his claim is that you can still be responsible for them because they still arise from this sort of general mechanism that's rational enough. I think that's the idea.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we've run aground on the debate about this, and I think it is fundamentally just that, like, I think that those things are all the results of luck, and it just seems weird to me that there could ever suddenly become a point in which the person becomes morally responsible. And you're right that the further arguments I'm presenting here don't necessarily rely on my position. I was sort of raising some concerns with the reflexive responsiveness approach as an alternative. But like, I don't ultimately, my argument doesn't ultimately hinge on whether, for example, you can really give me a situation that meets the criteria of reflexive responsiveness, and it doesn't feel very weird and counterintuitive to me to hold the person responsible there. My argument just rests on the constitutive luck problem, and I think you're saying you feel like it's not a problem, and I don't understand how that can work in certain cases, but not others. Essentially, I think we agree that
Oh, I don't.
constitutive luck. Well, hold on. I think we agree that constitutive luck is a problem when it comes to things like the born psychopath, right?
Uh-huh.
But you, for some reason, don't think that it's a
Oh,
problem in other
it's
cases.
because I don't think that's the problem with the born psychopath. I don't think that the I
What do
don't
you
think
think
the
is the
I don't
problem?
think the problem is the constitutive luck. I don't think the problem is how he came to lack those capacities. I think the problem is that he lacks the capacities.
Do you feel like the person who's born a psychopath as a person, as opposed to a person who is not born that way and does all the bunch of different things and then chooses to go on a murder spree, that there's no moral difference between them? Because that would seem to be problematic on your account, right?
I think that if the person who chooses to go to a murder spree has the kind of cognitive capacities that I'm talking about, yeah, I think they're responsible the way the born psychopath isn't. But the question is not that they, because remember, neither I nor anybody else think that you're responsible for whether you have the capacities that would make you responsible for other behavior, right? Nobody thinks you're responsible for that. The
Yeah, that
question we're
seems weird.
disagree.
Yeah.
That, well, I mean, that would just yeah, I think it would be a weird thing to think that you're responsible for, right? They have a, but I think the question is, given given that you do have those capacities, are you then responsible for what you do with them, right? You're not responsible for whether or not you have them, but if you have them, the question is, are you then responsible for what you do with them? And I think the
Yeah.
problem with the born psychopath, the thing about the born psychopath is just he's not responsible for anything he does, not because you know like that there's something about his situation that we can use the word luck to describe, but
Hmm.
because that would be he's not meeting the FWA requirements, right? All I'm saying is he's not meeting the reasons responsiveness requirements, right? So it's not that I think that in some cases, but not others,
Okay.
not meeting the FWA requirements is responsibility destroyed. It's that I think always in every situation,
Right.
not meeting the reasons responsiveness requirement is responsibility destroyed.
Let me say, I think you really captured right there exactly what I think our disagreement fundamentally is, right? You said that you feel, you can't be held responsible for whether or not you had the capacities, but you can be held responsible for how you act if you do have the capacities.
Right.
I think if you can't be held responsible for whether or not you have the capacities, it's impossible to then be held responsible for how you act based on the capacities. I think,
Yeah, that's the disagreement.
yeah, and I think that if you go in the direction that you're going in, I do think that it leads to potentially harmful. Well, let me say this: either it leads to harmful conclusions, or you have to avoid those by kind of tacitly avoiding saying that people who lack those capacities because of bad luck, should be treated differently than people who have those capacities because of good luck. And I don't think that there's a coherent way to reconcile those views in a way that can be functional for society and not sort of implicitly lead to treating the people who have bad luck less well in a way that people perceive as being correct and moral, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does make sense. I think that so I mean, my view is that those further bad consequences are not actually further bad consequences of that, because then in each of those cases, there are like 10 other questions that are just substantive questions that you have to ask what the right view is on before you get to the alleged consequence.
Mhm.
Whereas my contention would be that in terms of the bad consequences
Yeah.
of free will skepticism, I think that there's a pretty direct connection between sort of taking all the oomph out of the intuitively powerful argument against meritocracy, the intuitively powerful argument against closed borders, et cetera, and
Uh-huh.
free will skepticism.
Right, and so right, my response there, of course, is just I think I have a stronger argument against meritocracy on my view than on your view, because I think your view actually inevitably submits to the meritocratic idea that different outcomes are, when they are the result of the right kind of behavior, are ethical in a way that could in theory justify fairly substantial injustices, I think, in my view. Obviously, again, this is just a point in which we fundamentally disagree. But I also, sorry, that's another thing. Oh, I lost it. It's gone. It's fine.
Okay, okay, yeah. I mean,
Go ahead.
so my um yeah. So I mean, I think
Oh, sorry. I actually remembered
yeah.
it. The one other thing is I want to highlight,
Mm,
my argument is not based entirely on pure logical entailment here. I'm also
mhm,
basing it on psychological concerns based on psychological research. So when I
mm,
say I think your view leads to something, I don't necessarily mean that is the only logical conclusion that one could get to from a philosophical perspective. I mean, my concern is that when your view is disseminated into the world, the consequences are meritocracy. The consequences are increases belief in retributive justice. Even if you and I might agree that that is not a rational place to end up in, we also, I think, agree that people are, motivationally and psychologically complicated, and so it might be
mhm,
the case that your view is more likely to lead to something that is not rationally entailed but is still bad. Just like my view could, in theory, be leading to something that isn't necessarily entailed by it but is bad. And that's why I'm very serious about developing a pedagogy of luck that avoids problems like nihilism and fatalism, because it's not because I believe that my view necessarily logically entails nihilism and fatalism. If I did, I'd be
mhm,
looking for a different view. It's because I
mhm,
think people who don't understand these issues could very easily end up in that place if they haven't been scaffolded correctly to understanding these issues in a more
mhm.
sophisticated way. So that's why I think it is important to take into account not just logical entailment, but the realities of the social psychological situation into which we are, presenting these ideas. Because at the end of the day, like, neither you nor I is a like hard, just prescriptivist about language, right? We don't
Mhm.
believe there's an essential truth to what is free will and what isn't. The question is over, which account is more good for society or for people,
Okay, okay.
I think.
There I do. I hate to be disagreeable, but at the end here, there I do slightly disagree. Right. So I think that there
Hmm.
is, I think that I think there are really three issues. Right. I think one issue is whether one like captures how we use some phrase like free will in various contexts, in which case, sure, we agree. Let's not be too prescriptivist about that. We could always just say, you believe in
Hmm.
free will one, I believe in free will two. Fair enough, right? And then another issue is which of these views will be good for society. But I actually don't think those are the only two issues. I think there's a third issue, which is the one that is, objectively, and I understand you're a moral realist, but you're not a realist about this moral concept, but it's a moral concept that I take
Which one?
seriously, moral responsibility, right? So the third issue is which is the kind that's relevant to moral responsibility. The fourth one would be which is the kind that's relevant to the intuition that that you're that inequalities are unjust if they trace back to things that are outside of your control, right? That they have a so, and I think those third and fourth are just like substantive moral disagreements, and I think whoever's right, that should just be what we believe, even if it happens to be the case that psychologically believing it has bad consequences. Because we one of the things we agreed on in the first place is no noble lies, right? I mean,
Right.
let's just believe what's true here, and so I do think we have a disagreement that's not just about the consequences of believing these things. It's not just about like ordinary language. It's
So yeah,
also a moral
let me try
disagreement.
to
Yeah.
put a little bit of nuance on what I was saying there, right? We agree that the stakes shouldn't determine what we end up believing. What I was getting at there was that we also agree that the stakes, to some extent, should determine which definition of free will we care about and which one we end up
Mhm.
using, in the sense that, we believe that if we need to have an account of free will that can sustain moral responsibility,
Mhm.
right? And that we I think we agree that it would be bad to call something free will if it can't provide a foundation for assessments of moral responsibility. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think there's
Okay.
something I think there's something objectively, not in terms of the psychological consequences, not in terms of, like, how it leads people to act, but if something
Right,
just,
right,
like,
right.
objectively doesn't ground moral responsibility, that's
Mhm.
that it's probably not what what we're trying to capture when we argue about free will. I think that's correct. I wanted to
Okay.
say, since
Mhm.
he's asked it several times in the chat, so I wanna make
Sure.
sure he gets his question answered. This is a question for you from 255 AD, said, "In Aaron's view, is the kind of robust control he's talking about logically impossible? Like, what's" Oh, okay, maybe just like, I think that
Mhm.
second part might be a slight misunderstanding of you, but just
Innocence.
like um, but would it be possible in principle for this kind of, like, in other words, I think the question is like, is it just sort of a fact about our universe that this kind of control doesn't exist,
Mhm.
or in your view, could it not exist? And I actually kind of lean towards the second one, but I'm curious about what you think.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. So, I mean, clearly, I don't think it exists in our actual reality for entities like ourselves. And I think I come at this from a psychological kind of
Mm,
problem
mhm,
perspective rather than a pure logical argument. But I do
mm,
think,
mhm,
I think, Nagel's argument can be laid out in a formal logical kind of way that I think is sound and entails my conclusion. So it is a logical argument in that sense, but it involves premises about the nature of human psychology as something that is caused by prior events and things like that. I think what you would need for to avoid my problem, right, would be something probably like an unmoved mover, right? You'd need
mm,
something that was its own cause and was
mhm.
so and thereby in control of its nature from the very beginning. And I think that's a paradoxical concept ultimately. I mean, I don't want to get too far into theology, but I think
Sure.
like, you're going to have you're going to have some sort of nature there that is determining the behavior from the beginning, and you're going to have a Euthyphro problem, and like, I think maybe you and I probably are more in agreement on that kind of thing. So it depends on whether or not you think that God is logically impossible or,
Mhm,
some other kind of impossible, but like I don't think
mhm.
a lot hangs on that question for me and personally because
Sure.
either way, it's not functional for us, right?
Right. Yeah, no, that's fair. I think that's right. I think that yeah, so I think that's another thing we agree on, is that they have it's, you know, might or might not be logically possible that each of us could be a little unmoved mover, but, at any rate, it's certainly,
Yeah. I mean,
even
I
if
do
it's
think that's a kind of a soul view at the end of the day. You have to say there's a little self, as Nagel puts it, that's separate from the vicissitudes of luck.
yeah, so I think we agree that whether or not that's exactly logically impossible, it's certainly very different from the universe that we live in. What we disagree about is whether, given that, whether one of the kinds of control that we do have is a kind that's sufficient for moral responsibility, and then we further have some disagreements about what the political consequences are of coming down to one side or the other. Uh,
Mhm,
we
mhm.
could we could fruitfully, and I really do mean fruitfully, have another hour of conversation about
Yeah,
this.
for sure.
That we've already, we've already gone twice as long as we originally said that we were going to, because it was so interesting.
Yeah, I
But
appreciate you taking the extra time too, and I apologize that, we got a little feisty there, but I think it was good because I think we got to the root of our disagreements, and I think that is really valuable.
Fair enough. But it is my turn to make dinner. It would be my fault if I didn't.
It would be
So
bad if you didn't, even if it would just be the result of your, bad luck of being stuck talking to me.
yeah. All right. Thanks, Aaron. So people should check out Embrace the Void. I think I have a link in the description for the episode. And I will talk to you again, I hope, very soon.